Mesdames et messieurs, bonjour ou rebonjour, il est 12h00, alors nous enchaînons. Quelques mots en français avant de basculer en anglais, donc munissez-vous de casques de traduction si c'est nécessaire. Merci d'avoir rejoint cet amphithéâtre des Vallières. Il est le père du concept de négociation coercitive, un concept qui met à mal le leadership sur la scène internationale tel que nous le connaissons. En ces temps troublés marqués par une redéfinition des alliances et des enjeux régionaux, son approche va nous être très utile pour appréhender les nouvelles stratégies de négociation. Je vous demande d'accueillir Eugene B. Kogan, instructeur à Harvard et expert en méditation, pour un exposé d'une quinzaine de minutes qui sera suivi d'un temps de questions que je vous invite à préparer dès maintenant. Voilà, la scène est à vous.
Good afternoon, everybody. This is a quiet audience. Let me try this again. Good afternoon, everybody. All right. Thank you very much to the gentleman in the front. You get extra credit for being extra good. And thank you very much. Can everybody hear me in the back? You can hear me. So everybody probably knows the name Mark Twain, an American writer. Since this is a European audience, you may know the name of Richard Wagner. There are Germans in the audience, I believe, who you especially know Richard Wagner. So Mark Twain was once asked, what do you think of the music of Richard Wagner? And Twain responded, well, Wagner's music is better than it sounds. So I hope you'll have more gracious things to say about this presentation after I am done with it. I'm delighted to be back at École de Guerre. Je peux parler un petit peu français, mais je continuerai en anglais. Alors, si vous voulez parler un petit en français après, je serai heureux. But for an American, that's pretty enough in terms of French, with my apologies. Just a word about my background. I am a typical pracademic. I am a practicing academic. I am trained as a diplomatic historian of the Cold War. So you will hear echoes of history in my presentation. And you will get a sense that I am trying to, in these 15 minutes, do a very deep but hopefully thoughtful dive into what is a contemporary issue of great importance. And I was thinking, how do I introduce coercive negotiation? And something that I've spent a bunch of years studying and teaching, both at Harvard and elsewhere. I've written an article for the Harvard Negotiation Journal about how our current president, American current president, negotiates. And then the best way to introduce it, really, this image, I think, is seared in all of our minds. But it's not limited, as I would like to submit to you this afternoon, it is not limited to the present day. And so I want to put this in a little bit of a historical perspective. But before I do that, because I am trained as an academic, I want to draw out some theoretical themes that can hopefully give very practical application and understanding for what coercive negotiation is all about, just to better understand what happened right there in the Oval Office and what we observe almost on a daily basis this week and these months of the new Trump administration, because allies are rightly worried and wondering what is going on. So let me draw a distinct red line of difference between the traditional, AKA, also known as, Harvard thinking on negotiation. Encapsulated in, for many of you, maybe you can raise your hand if you've seen the book Getting to Yes, Anybody has even heard of the book Getting to Yes? So I have 3 in the audience, which is amazing. So that's a book you should get if you are interested in learning about the Harvard method of negotiating. And there, of course, as we've been learning since 2015, when Donald Trump ran for president, there is also the art of the deal. One of the most interesting things about the 2 books is that they came out about 6 or 7 years apart. And when they came out, almost nobody read The Art of the Deal. Nobody cared to know what a real estate developer thought about the art of negotiation. Well, now we do, whether we like it or not. Right? And what comes to mind is the expression by Leon Trotsky, the Soviet politician, strategist, thinker, murdered by Stalin. And Trotsky said famously, "You may not be interested in war, but war is interested in you." So we may not care what Trump says in The Art of the Deal, but we better. There are 2 things I want to point out here. One, on the fundamental approach the 2 books take. Getting to Yes exemplifies the approach to negotiation that's characterized by a sense of predictability, a sense that the 2 parties, or the multiple parties at the table, will design a process that is predictable enough for them both to follow, to explore their joint interests at the negotiating table. That is radically different from the way coercive negotiators behave at the table. And unpredictability, leaving the other side wondering what you're going to do, when you're going to do it, and how you're going to do it, is the essence of the coercive approach. And the reason, and I will illustrate all of this to you with a couple of historical examples. The reason this is the case is because it gives the side who is making things unpredictable, it gives them a lot of leverage. You might have seen in my background that I do a lot of advising for private sector, for boards of directors. This type of negotiation is omnipresent in both the international negotiations and in the commercial negotiations on which I advise. So in addition to the fundamental approach, what I want to, in these short minutes that I have, to point out to you, and of course I'm happy to continue the conversation during the Q&A and after, is the principal tool. The principal tool of what's called the interests-based negotiation, the Harvard approach. The principal tool there is building a relationship, even a micro relationship with your counterparts, whether it's your counterparts in the to some of you who are defense attachés in Paris or in other European or American capital, right? You're building a relationship with your host country. Ambassadors build these relationships with their host nations. CEOs build relationships with the counterparts across the table at mergers and acquisitions negotiations. Well, a coercive negotiator principally is interested in leverage. And that's a word that appears prominently in The Art of the Deal. And that is the single word I've been asked a number of times in the last day and a half. Well, tell me about The Art of the Deal. Tell me a phrase or a sentence. It doesn't have to be a phrase or a sentence. One word summarizes it all. But the issue is how leverage is used. And here I want to dig just for a couple of minutes even a little deeper. You may be familiar with the work of Thomas Schelling, the Nobel-winning economist who founded the John F. Kennedy School of Government, and who wrote during the Cold War, and if you haven't read this book, Arms and Influence, I highly recommend it to you, about the fact that to be coercive, and that is the topic for today, not kinetic, not the impact of power, whether it's economic power, financial power, military power, but to be coercive, Schelling writes, violence has to be anticipated. And if we want to understand the emerging geostrategic landscape between the United States and Europe, we need to think about this in the context of anticipation of violence. But not only that, Schelling adds, violence has to be anticipated and it has to be avoidable by accommodation. So if the counterpart does do what you are requesting them to do, you will in fact draw back. So in the much more mundane terms, if I say to you, just give me the coffee, which sounds like a very threatening thing to say, it would be a much nicer thing if I added, and nobody gets hurt. So you see, you do what I want, and we all walk out happy. I know the line of argument that I've made here has been very very serious and maybe very contemporaneous, focused on the approach of the current administration. Let me just share for just a couple of minutes before Jérôme throws me off the stage, that looking at history, and again, this is, you can take the man out of academia, but you can't take the academia out of the man, as we say in America. So the diplomatic historian here cannot help but draw parallels. If you think about Henry Kissinger and Richard Nixon's approach to settling the Vietnam War in the late 1972, early 1973, you see that the approach that the administration, the American administration, is currently taking towards Ukraine is eerily familiar. Because what folks are, of course, familiar with is the efforts to bomb North Vietnam into submission. Linebacker 1, Linebacker 2, right, Christmas bombing, the efforts to, not the efforts, but the mining of the Haiphong harbor. But what we're much less talking about is the way we, the United States, Kissinger delivered the letters from Nixon to Nguyen Van Thieu in South Vietnam, how we got our own ally to sign the agreement that they absolutely refused to sign. And the message was very, very simple, just per Schelling. You either sign the agreement or you lose American support immediately. And then we shall see how long Saigon will last. I am sure many of you will tell me, remind me how long Saigon lasted in the process. Nevertheless, the agreement was signed and a coercive mediation in many ways was done. I'll end on a historical, perhaps, note of certain pragmatism, if not optimism. Not optimism because I am an optimist only in the sense of an optimist talking to a pessimist, and the pessimist says, it can't get any worse, with the optimist replying, yes, it can. So I'm not an optimist, but I'm a pragmatist. If you look at the meeting that President Trump had with President Zelensky, it is very tempting to think this was an awful, and the 99% of the messages I receive are this was a disaster. It's only a disaster if we don't learn anything from it. Because if you think about another disastrous meeting that took place in 1961 between an American president and a Soviet leader, where JFK, pictured here, deeply unhappy, sitting next to the bombastic Nikita Khrushchev. JFK, who goes in thinking that, and I have studied JFK more extensively than I've studied Trump, which is hard to do because I've studied Trump too much. JFK goes in thinking, I will charm off the pants of the devil. I mean, this Soviet leader is nothing. JFK comes out of that meeting, ladies and gentlemen, saying to his staff, this was the worst meeting of my life. And guess what? This very meeting proved absolutely crucial a year and a half later. In the run-up to the very critical speech he's giving, JFK is giving on the 22nd of October 1962, in the midst of the Cuban Missile Crisis, JFK learned something from this meeting that he actually directly used. Because during this meeting, one of the things that Khrushchev got really upset about was a single word. The word was miscalculation. God knows what triggered Khrushchev on miscalculation. And in the heat of the Cuban Missile Crisis, Kennedy gets a draft of a speech that he is to give on the 22nd of October, announcing the quarantine. And the speech contains the word miscalculation. And Kennedy says, and you see the transcripts, right? You see the transcripts, and I'm ending on this, Jérôme. You see the transcripts of the meetings in the National Security Council, of the XCOM, where the president says, we will replace the word miscalculation with something else. And so this is, I hope, a note of optimism that says we can learn something from this and we can do better next time. And I'm absolutely sure that you will tell me now how we can do it better next time. So I welcome your questions, and thanks very much.
Thank you, Eugene, for